Hi everyone, I'm Roscoe Mutz. I'm helped produce this show you're about to see. I'm also an Odyssey volunteer. A couple of housekeeping items before I kick it over to the host for the show, Joe Sillins. Odyssey has decided, because of the pandemic, that we are going to have virtual shows for probably the near future and potentially the remainder of this year, depending on how things go with vaccines and other techniques to make it more safe for us to gather at our normal crowd size. So for the near future, for the upcoming Odyssey shows, they'll all be virtual, similar to the show you're just watching. What that means is we need our community and others who are checking out the shows to continue to support Odyssey. We are a nonprofit. We rely a lot on ticket sales, but during our virtual shows, we aren't charging for them. We're hoping to just connect people from around the country, around the world. And so we really encourage you, if you can, to donate to Odyssey. At our webpage, odysseystorytelling.com, there is a support tab with information about how you can donate. This is especially true when we launch the shows. Instead of having to charge people to see the shows, we'd rather make it a free will donation sort of thing. So if you feel inspired, if you can, kick in a couple bucks. It will help sustain Odyssey so we can continue to bring stories to you. We have our next show. The theme is shame. And I know that's the August show. I think that they are still looking for storytellers. So wherever you are, where you're seeing this, if you have a story that might fit the theme shame, then please email us at stories@odysseystorytelling, it's all together.com, stories@odysseystorytelling.com. We'd love to have you as part of the shame show. We're also working on a special event where we'll have another announcement about that called Black Stories Matter. So I believe we've got quite a few storytellers lined up for that, but just be on the lookout on our social media for another announcement about the Black Stories Matter show. As always, we continue to ask people not only to donate to Odyssey Storytelling, but any social justice organizations. Now is the time to do that if you have some funds. There are a lot of organizations that could use a little boost, especially at this point in our history. So with all that said, we're really excited to bring you another virtual show. It is my great pleasure. Our host for this show is Joe Sillins, who has hosted before. He's been a storyteller before, and he has put together a fantastic group of ragtag world travelers to share their stories of Vagabond Dreams. So I'll kick it over to Joe to get the show started.
Thank you, Roscoe, for that introduction. Tonight, of course, our theme is Vagabond Dreams. And for those of you who may be wondering, a vagabond is someone who wanders without a house or a job. And tonight we'll be hearing from 4 storytellers as they recount their own wanderings around the globe. Summer is a time for wandering. For many of us here in Tucson, as the mercury creeps up in May and June, we'll take just about any opportunity or excuse to escape the heat. I myself work in construction, much of which is outdoors, and I made it a point the last 3 years to take a month off during the summers to travel to cooler climes. I've gone to visit friends. I've gone to explore new places, meet new people, and find out what it's like to live in different communities. And I've really enjoyed these travels. I've relished these months away. But at the end of each month, I've been ready to return to Tucson, to my home, my work, and my community. But 2020 has been a different kind of year, and this summer is definitely shaping up to be a different kind of summer. Basically, due to all the uncertainty, some upcoming jobs, I haven't really put a big trip on the books, and it's kind of a bummer not being able to have a big trip to look forward to. kind of that light at the end of the tunnel, so to speak. But I really count myself lucky to be healthy, to be employed, and we're all just really doing our best to adjust to this new reality that we find ourselves in. We can't wander like we want to. We can't gather like we want to. Here at Odyssey, we'd love to see your faces all together in real space. Nonetheless, we're grateful to have you here with us in virtual space. And we hope the stories that you hear tonight will help satisfy your sense of summer wanderlust at least a little bit. Our first storyteller, you may recognize him from the Odyssey stage. You may also recognize his name from walls and murals around town. Joe Pagac was born and raised in Tucson, and while he does take great pride in being a part of this community and calling it home, he also loves traveling and exploring other parts of the world. So this is a story of one such trip.
Hey, my name's Joe Pagac, and I wanted to tell you a quick story about my favorite place on Earth. Back in 2008, I was dating a girl who wanted to go on a one-year trip when she graduated school and just kind of drift around the world, and I managed to add myself to her trip. And we started out just by kind of looking at places we were interested in and very loosely kind of charting a course. And then when we'd get to a country that we liked, we just find a reason to stay, find a job, find a way to volunteer, find something to do to keep us busy. And once we got bored, we'd just move on to the next spot. So we managed to go through 8 countries over that year and, had a total blast. But the place that I loved the most out of all those spots was a little island called Pulau Kapas that was off the eastern coast of Malaysia. The first time we pulled up, we had to hire a motorboat, and it took us across the ocean a couple miles out. And this little tiny island, you pull up to it, and it's about 1.5 miles long, and it's about 0.5 mile wide. And as you pull up, the first thing you notice, Pulau Kapas refers to the white, cottony sand beaches there. And just as the boat's starting to turn the engines down, you start to hear this 70s soul music drifting out over the water from the speakers there. And as we get closer, you can see this open-air restaurant and these little A-frame chalets all along the beach. And we pull up, we throw our bags off, and there's a little boat right next to us. It's a fishing boat. And the guys who worked at the restaurant are unloading fish from the fishing boat and throwing them right onto the grill. They're just picking whatever they want, fresh out of the ocean. And they're just wearing tie fisher pants and listening to this 70s music. And the sun's setting. It was just absolutely gorgeous. Tropical jungles behind this little restaurant. And right away I was like, man, this is the spot right here, And so we stayed about a week. And then when it was time to leave, I was like, man, what if we just stuck around? And so I had gotten to be friends a little bit with the owners. It was a local guy named Cayenne and a Dutch guy named Hans. Hans owned the restaurants, and Cayenne owned the little A-frame chalets, and they were working together to put this little show on. And I was like, what would it take to work here? And they were like, well, what can you do? I said, well, I did home rehabbing in college. Do you guys need any construction stuff done? And they're like, absolutely. We'll set you up. There's some little A-frames in the back that are kind of in disrepair. Why don't you fix one of those up as your first job? There's furniture in the warehouse. And from there, we'll just start finding work for you. And, we can't pay you, but we'll give you all the beer you can drink, all the cigarettes you can smoke, all the food you can eat, and a free place to stay for as long as you want to stick around and work. And I was like, yeah, absolutely, absolutely. Now, my girlfriend, did not have any background in carpentry, so they put her to work washing dishes in the kitchen and making tuna fish sandwiches, which she didn't love as much. But this isn't really a story about her favorite place on Earth. So anyway, I ended up never having to change out of my swimsuit after that. I'd get up in the morning, I'd work for a couple hours. Anytime I was hot, I'd just walk 50 feet and dive into the ocean right there. Just amazing coral reefs 10 feet into the water. I got to be friends with the guys who owned the little scuba place right down the beach from us, so I could use the scuba gear anytime I wanted to. I'd snorkel every day, and then we'd get to make they do runs to the mainland, so we do Mexican food night, and we'd cook for all the guests who were there, and we'd also get a chance to eat these foods that normally, being out on that island, you didn't really have access to. Just a wonderful time. And then eventually it got to this point where we had spent probably close to a month hanging out on this island, meeting all these really interesting people from all over the world. You had Italians coming in who, during the on season in Florence, they would go and sell little watercolors of the Duomo and of the different churches and stuff like that. And they would sit on the beach here in Malaysia and paint the same churches and Duomos in Italy in the off season when it was freezing there. And then they'd go back and sell them all during the on season. So just cool, fascinating people from all over the world cruising through that we got to hang out with. And then it came to this point where it was okay, are we moving on? The next destination was India. And, I wanted to go, but I also kind of didn't. So we had a talk about whether or not our relationship was going to last beyond this trip. And I was debating just ending it right there so I could stick around on this island forever. And we eventually decided, okay, we'll go on to India, and I'll stick out the trip. But I just never shut up about this place afterwards. I got back, I would tell everybody about it. I had a little Malaysian flag that I flew on my car for years. And then my current wife, I could tell she was getting sick of hearing about this place after a while. And so for our honeymoon, at this point, she was my girlfriend. For our honeymoon, I suggested going back there because I hadn't been there in, almost 10 years. And I thought, rather than her having to always think of this as a, place that nothing could live up to, we could make our own memories there. And she was totally on board with it. So for our honeymoon, we flew back to Malaysia and we cruised out to the little island, and we pull up and the same guys are there. It's Cayenne and Hans and, the A-frames and the restaurant, except Cayenne and Hans had gotten in a fight and they had split up. So now Cayenne built his own little restaurant over on his side, and Hans built his own little chalets on his side. And Cayenne's place was still all ramshackle and run down, and it looked like a collapsed treehouse. And Hans had these giant concrete condos that he had built with floor-to-ceiling glass windows, and now his restaurant had a whole penthouse built on top of it. And it was so interesting to see them not talking but living, 100 feet from each other still 10 years later. And, again, it was a wonderful place, and we're hanging out and scuba diving and snorkeling and eating this amazing food and paying almost nothing for a chance to spend the week on the beach. Our total bill for our room and our food and our beers and everything was $120 for the week. But things were the same, but they were also a little bit different. It was Cayenne now, he just seemed a little more beaten down by the fact that he was going through these struggles with having to maintain his own restaurant and his own hotel all by himself. And, at one point I had noticed that their check-in desk, which was a tiny little table, had a bowl sitting there, and it looked like there was a human pelvis sitting in it with a little bit of meat still on it. And I said, Cayenne, is that a human pelvis? And he said, yeah, man, it is. There was a girl here who was a doctor, and she told me that. And I was like, well, where'd you get it? And he's like, I found it in the ocean. And I said, well, shit, you should turn that into the police. And he's like, no, what would be cool is if we could solve the mystery of whose pelvis it is. And I was like, well, if you wanted to do that, maybe you could take a little bit of the meat off and send it into 23andMe or something. And, they could probably do a little genetic test on there. and tell you whose family members are on there, and you could probably solve it that way. He was like, oh, shit, yeah, that's great. You think I should do that? I said, no, you should turn it into the police. That's crazy. It's a human pelvis. And then Hans, I go over there, and, he was excited to see me, but going up into his penthouse where he's living now, it's all dark, all the windows are closed. He's just sitting there in a towel, and it was like the end of Heart of Darkness, This guy is just like ravaged by, I'm going to guess, drugs and, just like,
iPhone.
Just like 10 years of stress, and he's offering me Dutch cheese plates, or we're watching nature shows, but it just feels so dark and angry in there. And at one point, he's like, Joe, we're good friends, man. We're good friends. Do you think you could run some money and drugs for me back to the mainland when you head back? Like, they're not going to suspect you because you're just a tourist. And I said, no, absolutely not. It's a death penalty, and I don't really feel like dealing with that shit. I'm just trying to vacation a little. Like, we're not that great of friends. And anyway, so with that said, we had a great time. And, we got some great kayaking in and some hiking and some snorkeling and all that. But, it was so interesting because the place stays the same and the memories stay the same. And we lived all the same memories again. And she got to really see where I was coming from, which was so cool to be like, this is Cayenne and this is Hans and this is the restaurant I worked in and everything. But like, no matter what, it's like you can go back to the place and you can go back to the people, but time changes everything a little bit. And it's, even though it's the same memories, it's also new memories that, you can never go back and really recreate that exact same thing again. It's always going to be new, even if it's the same. So, I just, it was still its own version of heaven, but it was a little bit different the second time. All right. That's my story. Thanks. I'm Joe Pagac.
Thanks, Joe. I am one of the people who is fortunate to have lots of friends who have lots of good travel stories. So Joe was an obvious pick. He's one such person, one such friend who is not afraid to get up on stage in front of 100, potentially more people to share a story. And our next storyteller is another friend of mine, and I'm really glad she took me up on my offer to tell a story. And we first met when we were in an internship program through the University of Arizona. We were down in Nogales, Sonora, working on different community projects. And since then, we've become fast friends and perennial Mexican vacation buddies. And so without further ado, joining us from Corvallis, Oregon, I present to you Carrie Lipnick.
I used to work on community health projects in Nogales on the Mexican side of the border for the University of Arizona. We would do things like composting toilets, gardening, water harvesting, alternative construction materials, things like that. I made really good friends with some of my community partners and just wanted to see more of Mexico. To that end, I bought a motorcycle and rode it all the way to Guatemala and back over one summer. It was a crazy trip, an amazing experience that probably should have killed me, not because of any violence in Mexico, but because I was really terrible at riding a motorcycle when I started out. I got back from that. I had decided that I wanted to become a teacher, but I didn't have my undergrad in teaching, so it was just sort of an idea in my head. My mom is a teacher, so I would see her working just all the time. And I thought that I was smarter than her, so if I became a teacher, I would find a system to just make it not very much work. And then I would have time for a side hustle, because teachers don't make that much money. So my idea to sort of incorporate wanting to travel in Mexico and teaching together was to start a business importing green beans into the United States. It would be a great excuse to travel around Mexico visiting farms, and I would make a little bit of money while I did it. Something a little bit more than tourism. So this trip that I'm going to talk about was about 10 years ago, which is really crazy to think about because in that time, just about everything about my life has changed. My old job's gone, my dog, my truck, my boyfriend, all of them are gone. I don't even live in Arizona anymore. The only thing that really has stayed the same is my friends. And this guy, Joe, who you all know, and I traveled to Mexico with, he's my friend then, he's still my friend now. So we're somewhat star-crossed travel buddies. We definitely have had some misadventures. But on this trip, he was going to go and investigate natural building, and I was going to go visit some farms and look at importing coffee to the United States. The trip started out great. We had a slight hiccup in the beginning when we got distracted drinking beers, missed our flight, and had to sleep in LAX. But other than that, we were doing lots of fun things, and it was going really well. Eventually, we get to Oaxaca City. That's kind of where we part ways. I went to the Safeco warehouse. Safeco is a coffee cooperative in Oaxaca, and was learning more about the importing process and shipping of the coffee. So the coffee business is heavily stacked against the small farmer. Even fair trade coffee, a pound of beans sells for about $1.50, which would retail in the United States for between $15 and $20. The value is added as you move further along in the process, and very little of it gets back to that original farmer. So the rationale for these cooperatives is to hold on and maintain control of that coffee for further along in the process, so that the communities that actually grow the coffee can reap some of the benefits of this multi-billion-dollar industry. While I was at the coffee warehouse, I met Elpidio, who actually reminded me of some of my community partners in Nogales. He was a very small man, but very, very strong. He was quiet, but you could tell that he liked to kick back and relax and drink a few beers every once in a while. We talked for a little bit, and I asked him if he would be interested in showing me his hometown and his coffee growing operation. On the bus to Santa Catarina Losicha, Elpidio and I were both kind of quiet and shy. But once we got there and he started showing me his land and the shared greenhouse they had going in town, he was extremely informative about the process of coffee from plant to cup, how the business worked, how the cooperative worked, the history of the town, all of that. But as he talked, it became more and more apparent to both of us that I actually didn't really know what I was doing. I'm not a farmer. I had told him, about my research for the University of Arizona and my idea to start a business, but it all sounded muddled, probably because it was actually muddled in my head. I didn't have any money to start a business. I was like dumpster diving like 6 months before I went on this trip. I barely had enough money to go on the trip. So eventually Elpidio and I are just sitting outside on some plastic stools, talking and drinking mezcal. So we do that for a little while. We're pretty deep into it when this guy Filiberto comes by. And Elpidio introduces me to Filiberto, and Filiberto is the mayor of Santa Catarina and one of the heads of the cooperative. So Filiberto was a little bit more wary of me. He kept asking me questions about my university affiliations and a little bit about coffee. And eventually he stops for a second, he leans in, and he just tells me, "You're CIA, aren't you?" And in my head, I'm like, shit. But I tried to play it off, like, no. Like, I gave him my cover story. When we moved on, Elpidio was like, "No, she's cool, man." He just kept coming back to it. And Filiberto, even before he got to us, was pretty drunk. And I could see the way other people were treating him with extreme deference, probably because he was mayor. So, like, he would knock something over or stumble, and nobody would say anything about it. So I'm worried he's gonna decide that he wants to tie me to a chair and interrogate me. So I started to sober up pretty quick. That's not to say I've always wanted to be a secret agent, but I would be terrible at disguises, and I think I'm way too disorganized to be a successful secret agent. I usually don't agree with the politics. It wouldn't go well. I do understand why he thought that, though, because the United States, they hear cooperative and they think communism, and the CIA has a long history of interfering to support big business interests, especially in Latin America. So I totally understand where he was coming from with that, but I just definitely wasn't CIA. So eventually LPU and I got out of there, and we're kind of staggering home on this deserted road, sort of buoyed by the bubble of intimacy you get when you just talk and drink for hours. I don't want to characterize Elpidio as lecherous because he was the nicest guy, but we're like kind of like holding on to each other. And at one point, he just like leans away from me, reaches into his pants, and starts pissing, like balancing on me with one arm. And I swear that's the closest I've ever been to another person as they pissed. I think I got some of it on my shoes. Just a vivid memory for me. We get back to his house. I crashed for like 2 hours in one of his daughter's rooms. And he puts me on the public transportation to the coast where I was going to meet Joe, which was actually a pickup truck. I was hoping to sleep in this pickup truck, but it was actually pretty miserable. I was jammed in the back of the cab with these two guys, and like we were so close together that my leg was like kind of on top of one of the other guy's legs. So I was like molding myself into the wall and just like tensing every muscle in my body away from this guy as we just like swerved down the mountains. I just remember watching the like two yellow dots of the headlights go back and forth and all over the place as like my muscles and my stomach were convulsing. Between 4 and like 12 hours later, we got to Puerto Angel. I have no idea how long it actually took, but it seemed like forever. I found the rendezvous point where me and Joe had decided to meet. It was a hotel. I checked in and I passed out. I was still sleeping about 12 hours later when in the middle of the night, Joe, after his own harrowing journey down the spine of the mountain, arrived to town. Unfortunately, the hotel was locked, so he's outside like yelling, and I can't hear a thing. He gives up and pitches his tent on the beach. And that's where I found him the next morning. He was looking groggy, but, you know, as always, ready to party. It was definitely a very interesting trip. I ended up becoming a teacher, and I hustle enough at my actual job. I don't need any other side hustle on top of it. As I did more research into coffee, like all the money is in the toasting. So if you want to get into coffee, roast the coffee, don't import green beans. But I was looking up place names for this story. So I was like in the bowels of my Google inbox at about 10,000. And I read an email that I had sent to the Central Cooperative. The last line said, "I'm working on composting toilets in Nogales, Sonora, and am wondering if you could put the coffee on the bus and I'll pick it up at the bus stop. Maybe in another life. Thank you."
Thank you, Carrie. You know, even though I was on that trip with her and I have told many stories, traded many stories with Carrie since then, I don't necessarily know that I've heard that story in its entirety. So I'm really glad that Carrie joined us to share this evening. Trips with Carrie were never dull. We share a thirst for learning about new culture and connecting with locals. We both love outdoor adventures and picturesque scenery. And we also don't have an abundance of caution, and we don't like to overplan trips, which is a combination that's always exciting, but sometimes got us in trouble. Well, this brings us to our intermission. And normally we would invite you all to get up, stretch your legs, get some refreshments, and join us in about 5 or 10 minutes. So I'd like to do the same. I'd like to invite you to hit pause on your video or your podcast and then rejoin us in about 5 or 10. So as you may know, this is only our third storytelling event over Zoom, and we're still adjusting to this new paradigm. It's a little bit tough doing this when you don't have an audience in front of you. You don't have the adrenaline, the excitement of having a crowd in front of you. You don't have their reactions to gauge, to fine-tune timing and tone, you know. If anything, you just have your own face to look at, which certainly presents its own challenges for me in particular. It's kind of like when you hear an echo of your voice during a phone call and you can't get over the way you sound. But while virtual storytelling has its drawbacks, it also has its benefits. Now we're able to share stories with people all over the country and the world. And we're also able to invite storytellers from other communities to join us and share their stories. So while this is his first appearance on the Odyssey stage, our next storyteller is no stranger to telling and has appeared on Moth Story Slams and even started his own storytelling group. Paul Barach is joining us from Tacoma, Washington. His first book, Fighting Monks and Burning Mountains, Misadventures on a Buddhist Pilgrimage, is available in ebook, audiobook, and print formats. I present to you Paul Barach.
So in 2010, I was working in an office and sighing every morning when I woke up. And one day I just decided, you know what? I'm going to leave this job and go walk an ancient Buddhist pilgrimage in Japan. Here's some things I did not decide to do. Learn Japanese. Learn to read a map. Check if it was the hottest summer on record in Japan. Make sure my shoes fit. But I went anyway with just that sheer unearned confidence of a guy in his 20s. And like I wasn't sure exactly what I was searching for out there, but I just figured that, you know, after walking 750 miles and praying at 88 temples circling Shikoku Island on a 1,500-year-old pilgrimage, I would have some epiphany somewhere. So cut to about 2 weeks in, I've already been charged by a boar. I have spent an entire day collapsing from dehydration hiking up a mountain. And so I figure, you know, most of my problems are done. I should mention that there was one other thing that I was not expecting, which was I could not find food. Like, I don't know what the deal was. I do know it was probably my fault. But for whatever reason, like every day I would be searching and I couldn't find like a grocery store. I was burning probably 6,000 calories a day. And if I was lucky, I was putting back 2,000. So, you know, 2 weeks in, I'd lost 10 pounds a week and looked like Bane with cancer, just for the visual. So it's 2 weeks in, day like any other. I'm hiking, it's hot, I'm starving, and I'm just on this ribbon of concrete, my feet hurt, and suddenly I come across a 1950s style diner. Like, I shake my head because I'm like, that's a mirage. It's still there, and I'm like, oh my God, I am saved. Like, and I run inside ready to just cause a hamburger shortage in Japan. And I get inside and I ding the bell and no one answers. And I ding the bell again, hoping it works this time, and nobody answers. And that's when I start looking around and realizing there's no sounds coming from the kitchen, and there's a layer of dust on everything. But it is a 1950s style diner. Like, there's pictures of Marilyn Monroe and Elvis on the walls, and that really specific red and white checked vinyl tablecloth on all the tables. But there's a layer of dust, and that's when it hits me. I'm in a museum. And arguably worse, the Twilight Zone. Like, I was convinced that I would walk outside and just have Rod Serling smoking a cigarette being like, Paul Barach thought he could go to Japan and just eat every day. Well, fuck that guy. So that threw me off. By the end of the day, still barely found food. I think I've eaten a melon at that point. And so I'm just looking for a place to crash. But the highway I'm walking on, I can find no place to set up my tent. And so I keep going, and the path leads up through this orchard. And as I crest out of the orchard, I find myself on a college campus. And I'm like, oh man, I'll just sleep here. And then I see security guards wandering around. I think, no, I won't. So I got to keep moving. And so at this point, I just have tunnel vision, and I'm looking through this tunnel, trying to get through the campus, and I come to a locked metal gate. And I'm stuck because I can't climb over it, and there's nowhere to sleep behind me, and I can't get through. So I go back into this bathroom I just passed, and I just wash my face in the sink and let my last 2 brain cells die. And as I'm looking into the mirror, I see behind me that the toilet stall doors go down to the floor. And so I push my backpack in and my walking staff and my pilgrim's hat, and I just am sitting on the toilet trying to think of like what I can do. And that's when the lights click off. And I'm so tired, I think, this isn't the worst place to sleep. And the next thing I know, the lights click back on, and I hear the security guards walking through the bathroom, and I realize this is the worst place to sleep. Because now I am trespassing on private property in the most expensive country on earth, which means if I get caught, not only am I getting deported, I am going bankrupt from the fines. And so I just stay very still and very quiet, and the guards leave, and the lights click back off. And I'm just so tired that the next thing I know, the lights are back on, and I'm so startled when I wake up that time, I hit my walking staff, and it clicks against the porcelain of the toilet. And inside the stall, that click is deafening. And the guard's boots stop right outside the door. And I am just petrified. I am frozen in place. And even through all of that terror, with my future totally out of my hands, this bloom of compassion opens in my heart as I realize that this feeling I have right now has been shared by people throughout history. You know, it's been shared by the besieged as they hide from soldiers and rubble, and it's been shared by immigrants crossing the border. And I realize that this is the exact same feeling my grandparents must have felt as they cradled my infant father in the back of a bread truck, as they went from Soviet-occupied Poland and smuggled themselves into American-occupied Germany after the war. And for a moment, I just felt connected to the suffering of so many people. And then, a moment later, I think, you're none of those things, Paul. You were a 28-year-old hiding in a toilet stall. Shouldn't you be at home with a mortgage? So for whatever reason, probably they didn't want to deal with whatever was in the toilet stall. The guards leave. And so throughout the night, it's barely falling asleep, waking up when the lights come on. But finally, around 5 a.m., I realize, like, okay, if I leave now and the guards find me, they'll just think I'm a pilgrim that started early. and not some idiot who slept in a toilet stall all night, because who would do that? And so I get out of the stall, and I get out, and I look around, there's no guards to be found, and I walk back to the gate, and it's still locked. But because I've slept, in quotation marks, the tunnel vision's gone, so I can now see the 3-foot stone wall connected to the gate leading out. So I kind of sigh and put my backpack on the wall and step over the wall. And the moment I'm outside, it hits me, I'm in Japan, the most polite culture on earth. If they'd have caught me, they would have spent 5 minutes apologizing for not letting me sleep in their toilet stall, and then driven me to a hotel. Which is why the first line of that journal entry does read, "Do I ever tell anyone this happened?"
Thank you, Paul, for sharing that great story. Well, this brings us to our last storyteller of the show. I first met Yasmin about 6 or 7 years ago when she was living in Tucson. We quickly hit it off based on our shared love of travel, music, and Mexican food, and we've kept in touch occasionally ever since. Mainly, I just follow her travel adventures over Instagram and Facebook, and so she was a natural choice to recruit for this show. And I'd like to welcome to the Odyssey stage from her home in Albuquerque, New Mexico, Yasmin Khan.
So I've realized that my travel stories mark my privilege. As a brown woman from a working class family, I know my privilege is different than white travelers. My privilege is different from Black travelers. My privilege is different from men or the rich or people with relatives who gift frequent flyer miles. The privilege spectrum is a sliding scale, and depending on where I happen to travel, my position as a brown woman slides along that scale. The privileges I'm allotted while traveling as a brown person through Norway to camp on Arctic beaches is different from the privilege I experienced moving through crowded markets in Bangladesh as a relatively white-skinned person. I can see it and feel it now, but I was oblivious to this sliding scale for many years. And I think it's because I didn't start off as a traveling person. Growing up in Chicago, we didn't take family spring break trips to Jamaica or the Bahamas like so many of the rich kids in our junior high and high school who would come back tanned and have their blonde hair in cornrows. Instead, we explored Chicago's Chinatown and Polish neighborhoods and Greek restaurants. My dad took us out to all the taxi cab joints where Pakistani cab drivers and Nigerian cab drivers ate. He thought it was the best part of Chicago. If we had the money, my parents and sisters and I went to the St. Louis Arch, the Michigan sand dunes, and I realize now that my dark-skinned Indian father and my light-skinned Italian mother never took us further south than the Kentucky Derby by design. The first time I really traveled was way south, and it was as an adult at 18, driving to Daytona Beach for spring break with my best friend. And I remember that moment, the awe of driving from frozen Chicago in March and seeing palm trees for the first time from the window of my little Honda Civic hatchback. And that's when I realized that I could move from point A to B, that there was no magic about it, and that it was accessible to even people like me. And since then, I've jumped at any chance I had to win grants or conduct research or present at conferences, from Mexico to Thailand, from the Netherlands to India. I lived 5 years in Bolivia exploring the Andes, the Amazon tributaries, the salt flats, and the rich mix of indigenous cultures. I did the same thing in Mexico, taking 5 years to wander from Juarez, the Yucatan Peninsula. I reveled in how light and free it feels to travel alone, to not answer to anyone, to make my own itinerary. And I enjoy the slow exploration of places when I get to stay for weeks or months or even years, moving from country to country by train, when I can, or plane if I have to. But it did take 20 years of traveling the world and a PhD dissertation on refugee apologies to really dig into how privilege has shaped my mobility. I have a little blue book with the United States of America stamped on it that gets me through borders, and I speak English. Those two tools that I took for granted have allowed me to move freely across this planet. Now, my work with Rohingya refugees in Bangladesh has highlighted the arbitrary absurdity that dictates how and why some of us are allowed to move and some aren't. For 4 years, I've been traveling to Bangladesh for my PhD in human geography and women and gender studies at the University of Toronto. In Bangladesh, I met Khaleda. She teaches elementary school English in the world's largest refugee camp, where she lives with 1 million other Rohingya refugees. She's 27 years old and she has a 2-year-old son. She's gentle and she speaks softly with a round face and big eyes. Sometimes she wears a hijab, sometimes she wears a burqa, depending on where we're going, which is always inside the camp borders. She's the youngest elected representative of her community and the only elected female representative of the entire 1 million-person camp. She's been working for years to fight police brutality against her community and to support women's education. Khaleda has a dream to start a community library. She also speaks 4 languages, and she learned English by watching shows on her cell phone. She's super impressive. And Khaleda does have Vagabond Dreams, but because she's been rendered stateless by the Myanmar government, she isn't allowed to travel outside her cramped refugee camp. And listening to Khaleda's dreams to see London or to see New York triggered my ongoing exploration into why I get to move and she doesn't. So I met Khaleda in 2017 during my first trip to the Rohingya camps. When I first went to Bangladesh, I had no idea what to expect. And she really helped me through all the twists and turns of this massively growing temporary city. So she told me about a story of a year before I met her in 2016. Khaleda and her family all together had a fantastic opportunity to relocate to Australia all together. So like I said, Khaleda and millions of other stateless Rohingya, they have no passports. They have no state authority to vouch for them as they move through borders. So moving to Australia through the UN resettlement process is the only opportunity Khaleda and her family had to legally move out of the camp. And only a few people got that opportunity back in 2016. After the paperwork was done, they were all ready to go, and Khaleda's father fell ill. So she, as the eldest daughter, decided to stay and care for him while he was sick, thinking she would catch up with her family later, that both of them would go later when he was well enough to travel. And just like that, her family moved on, and that was the last time she ever saw them. Because that window of opportunity, that whole UN program just shut with no explanation, no warning, leaving Khaleda and her father in the camp where she still lives today. And so these days, I just came back from the camp in November, and coronavirus hit, a few months after that. But now I talked to Khaleda, and she said they can barely even move around inside the camp because coronavirus is spreading through basically the city around the camp villages and inside the camp, which is now called the COVID red zone by the Bangladeshi government. But the camp itself is an experience that people that I've worked with in those camps that have been to Afghanistan, to Yemen, to Uyghur camps in China, they've never seen anything like this camp. It's the largest camp in the world with 1 million people, a population that matches Albuquerque, where I am now. There's only 10 square meters of space per person, which is 1/4 of the 40 square meters per person required by the United Nations. But people are just so crammed in there, and there's no more space to go. 15 people can live crammed into a 150 square foot shed. And these tiny, tiny sheds made with little tin roofs and bamboo sticks and just plastic sides, they stretch endlessly into the distance. And from the top of a hill, it looks like a painted backdrop of like an apocalyptic movie. And the Rohingya, who are hardworking communities of farmers and fishers, have been made dependent on aid since they're not allowed to work or to move on to other countries, even if they have family or job prospects somewhere else. So, and my research looks at how Bangladeshi populations living near the camp are impacted by aid policies that don't serve them, but still affect them. Like, for example, how dealing with the deforestation and water scarcity linked to containing 1 million people is impacting the people that were already living there. So I've been going back there for 4 years, and after my second visit to the camps in January 2018, I decided to live there, and I found a local Bangladeshi family that would host me, and they are mostly women and babies since the men were working in different cities or countries. So in the beginning, the women I lived with, two of them, two of many, Nishi and Rumi, were their names, they constantly asked me all the time, "You go anywhere you want by yourself?" And they looked at me as if I just landed in their backyard on a flying carpet. It was incredulous to people, especially to women who had never had the chance to even leave that village. But they knew every single corner of that village, and although they were not all blood relatives, they were more deeply involved in each other's families and caring for the children of people in the entire village who just could come through and eat and sleep and get help with whatever they needed. They were more of a family than most families I've ever known anywhere else in the world. Living there, I had a room with a big carved wood bed, a squat toilet, which was just like a hole in the ground, and a bucket shower. And for 2 years, I watched the rice paddy outside my window change from a dry, trash-strewn dirt patch to sparkling flooded paddy in the monsoon season to green rice and then back to dirt. And I watched as the vegetable plot behind the house, that was the main vegetable plot for a group of widows, was taken over by an NGO and then turned into a toilet production site for the camp, which left all those families and the widows without place to grow their food and also leaving them without toilets. And this was how I came upon my research, watching the envy and the anger of poor Bangladeshi farmers who lost their land, lost their grazing land, didn't have toilets, but were watching as right in their backyard, literally in their backyard, NGOs were producing thousands of toilets for their Rohingya neighbors. And this camp, this village that I lived in was only about 5 kilometers from Kaleda's camp. But even being that close, just about 15 minutes away in a bicycle rickshaw, never once could Kaleda visit me at this house. She even had a fake ID that allowed her to reach the town of Cox's Bazar, where most of the NGO workers lived and partied and drank beer and swam in rooftop pools. She could occasionally go through there to visit me, but she risked being arrested and imprisoned if she did. But sure enough, after my second visit, she did risk arrest when she came to see me off at the airport. And then I, with my passport and my English, got on a plane to Singapore, where I wandered museums and ate foods I never knew existed. I went to Istanbul, where I visited mosques and browsed glittering markets. I went to Bordeaux to have wine with my friends from Mexico City. I went to Norway to hike the fjords. I went to Spain to lay around the nude beaches of Caña de Meca. Then to Chicago to be reunited with my family. And by then, after years of this, I began to feel disoriented. And sometimes for the first few seconds after waking up in the morning, I couldn't even tell where I was. Was I in Bali or Singapore, in Italy or Canada? And that's when I knew I needed to really examine why I was moving around so much. Because I've always expressed gratefulness for the chance to travel, especially for traveling alone as a woman. And I've always encouraged women to go where they want, when they want. But now I see how my encouragement of just go where you want is tone deaf, because people can't just go where they want, when they want. My encouragement to just go explore the world is akin to the annoying mantra of choose a job you love and you'll never work a day in your life. That can only be the reality for those of us who have total agency over our lives, those of us who have won the global mobility lottery or the actual lottery. After meeting Kaleda and hearing her dreams of visiting London and New York, and also knowing how little chance there is of she and her son ever leaving that camp, I became ashamed of all my Instagram travel posts, my stories of being lost and photos of the food I ate, showing off the textiles I bought from markets around the globe. It felt so frivolous. My mobility privilege hung heavy on me, and especially the shame of passing so many years not understanding what this privilege meant. I even made a second Facebook page to add all my Bangladeshi and Rohingya friends, and I only posted photos of Bangladesh just to make myself feel better, to hide my privilege. I'm also aware of my Western tendency to glorify travel as a badge of experience or having lived in the world, and now I know it's not. Traveling from point A to B is not more valuable than spending a lifetime in point A, putting down roots, getting to know people, building meaningful friendships and relationships. And this Western culture pushes us to value moving on from our homes, which is a contrast now, I see, to the 70 million people who have become refugees, who simply want to go back home or to a place that can become a new home. So now I'm back in Albuquerque just by chance, was pushed out of Spain when coronavirus hit. And I'm spending time in my own home, a little adobe house that I bought 20 years ago. And I'm realizing how deeply grateful I am for this spot, someplace that I don't ever need to move from. But the idea that I can stay where I want is also part of the privilege of mobility, to have agency over when you stop moving. So I still talk with Khaleda and the Bangladeshi family that I lived with when they have internet access. And like many of us right now, they're staying home, wearing masks, homeschooling their kids, washing their hands 20 times a day. And I know if I ever want to see them again, it's up to me to go, and I do want to see them. So I'm not done traveling. I want to continue because I know so many women of color will never enjoy the mobility freedoms that I enjoy. And I also won't stop encouraging women to travel solo. What I will do is check my privilege and be more vocal about my respect for people who live in one place their whole lives, to learn that place and its people deeply. I'll be more vocal about the satisfaction of slow travel, of travel focused on deeper connections and less on how many passport stamps you collect. And I will be sure to remind my parents of how lucky we were to be able to visit the sand dunes, the St. Louis Arch, and all the days of exploring the deep corner of Chicago as children.
Thank you, Yasmin, for sharing that story. I think it's a really timely message about how we can all start unpacking our privilege and thinking about the systems that lift some of us up while keeping others down. And that brings us to the end of our show. I want to thank our storytellers for sharing their travel adventures. I want to thank you, the audience, for joining us, and also thank the Odyssey volunteers, our producers, Roscoe and Miles, and Anna for her assistance with the storytelling event. Stay safe out there, and we'll see you all soon.